Oh, welcome. It's great to see everyone here in person. All of you are heroes in my mind because you were able to overcome the weather, the severe weather conditions. And for those that are online via Zoom, um, I'm sure your hearts are here, so that warms my heart too. And today, we're gonna have a good conversation. It's worthwhile for you, for all your fight against the low temperature. And I'm Eric Mao. I'm a partner of the Geopolitical Forum. This is the first time I'm able to say that because now we have partners. I'm just not by myself. We have like people that I think have the potential to enhance the brand of the Geopolitical Forum. At the same time, can enhance their own individual brands. So I'm open to new partners. If you're interested, the door is open. We can talk. I'm very excited for this new partnership, for this new year, and for 250 years of the United States of America. It's never been easy to be America's neighbor. And it's never been easy for those to share the same hemisphere with the United States of America. So they recently, Canadians spoke out, you know, and even Canada, right? They came to their senses, or they're able to. They think it's time for them to speak out. But today, the topic is not about Canada; it's about Venezuela. So just 3 days, barely 3 days into this new year, United States went down to abduct the leader, the head of state of Venezuela. Along with all the escalation, all the military action since September, destroying ships, killing crews, it's obviously violation of international law, obviously. But I doubt this case will ever be brought to ICC, International Criminal Court. But in the court of public opinion, it's the burdens on the U.S. to defend its action. There are many ways to defend it, as we have probably been exposed to. Of course, there are multiple sides, multiple sides to each story. And there are many sides in this story. There's multiple sides, or at least 2 sides within Venezuela. And in the United States, also diaspora, Venezuelan diaspora in the United States. So it's very interesting. And we're fortunate to have someone. And also, the history didn't start January 3rd, right? Military action. Also didn't start September with all the escalation September last year. It goes back more than that. So we're fortunate to have someone who lived through the history himself and to share his experience and insights with us at the Geopolitical Forum. Actually, he himself is also a member of the Geopolitical Forum. And his name is Eduardo Martinez. He is a Venezuelan national who witnessed firsthand the country's descent into political repression, economic collapse, and hyperinflation. A victim of state violence during the 2014 protests, he lived through severe shortages, currency shortfall, currency freefall. It's actually too much currency, it's not shortfall currency. And daily instability before relocating abroad. His lived experience shapes his perspectives today, where he focuses on explaining Venezuela's crisis through historical context, geopolitical dynamics, and human cost behind the headlines. Behind the headlines is a treat for us, because we all have headlines we can access to it, but how often you're able to get behind the headlines. I don't know about you, but every time before I go to buffet, which I don't go very often, but when I go to buffet, I want to go starve. So I will starve myself before I go, right? Like in this case, I haven't learned about Venezuela for a week, so boy, am I hungry. Let's get started. So I'll start with a conversation with Eduardo for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open to the floor, to the audience, also to people on Zoom. Let's get started. So welcome, Eduardo.
Thank you for having me. Very excited to be here.
That's great. So tell us, where were you when you heard the news of Maduro's capture on January 3rd? And what was your first emotional reaction and your second, more analytical one?
Yeah, so January 2nd, my wife was recovering from the flu, or not recovering, I should say. She had actually gotten a fever that night, like 105 degrees. So we were up late and just kind of monitoring, making sure that she was, the fever was coming down. So I was up late. I was up pretty late that night. And around 1 something in the morning, I get a message from my brother, and he and his wife live in Argentina. And he's saying, they're bombing Caracas. So immediately just jump onto X, formerly known as Twitter, and start monitoring the situation, as they say, and trying to see what's going on. Given, my wife was very sick, we have 2 young children, I end up going to sleep around 2:30 in the morning, just kind of fall asleep and be like, whatever happens, I'll see what happens in the morning. So I wake up around 5 a.m. And obviously see the news that, at that point, Maduro had been taken out of Venezuela. I mean, there was just a huge amount of uncertainty. So, kind of went over and woke my wife up and told her and just started, crying. I think there's a lot of emotion for Venezuelans around this topic, especially when you've suffered it and continue to, in some ways, be a prisoner to a lot of what the regime has done, right? Separations of families, ongoing repression, the inability to go back to your country, the inability for you to exert your rights as a citizen of that country, whether it's giving that nationality to your children or just simple things that are your, birthright. So that was my emotional response. Definitely very happy to see something that was going to open up a pathway. And that aligns with my analytical view on it, which is that it opened up many pathways that weren't there before the actions of January 3rd. And I had felt very confident early on when they raised the, overall bounty on Maduro to $50 million that there would be some sort of action, that he was either going to end up in prison or end up killed. I felt that was an inevitability, given the amount was significantly more than what had been the amount over Osama bin Laden, for example.
Okay. So the January 3rd operation took less than 30 minutes. So what does it tell you about the regime's actual military capability versus its mythologized invincibility?
So I think there's a few factors there. There's the speculative one, which is to say that Maduro was sold out by other folks within the regime that wanted to, seize power. I think there's a possibility of that. I don't find it super likely personally that was the case. But I think it is evidence of 2 things for me, at least. One, that, you reap what you sow, and what the Venezuelan regime has, sowed for decades is intentionally dividing up the military within Venezuela. And so as an example of this, I think we have over 2,000 generals, which is very uncommon to have in your military, that many high-ranking members. This is done to make the military itself coup-proof, because if you have small amounts of power, you can't have one general that turns against you and then coups, the government. You have to convince maybe many others, right? So 2,000 is just a huge number. I think it's the most number of generals of any military. And so
per capita.
Certainly per capita. And so you have a hollowing out of the institutions over 27 years. You have the filling of every institution within the country with loyalists and not necessarily people that are capable of doing the roles. So I think that's factor one that leads to the success of obviously the world's most powerful military being able to carry out this attack. That's part one. The second part I would say is that, a lot of the backing from a military perspective to Venezuela over the years has historically been combination of Russian, Iranian, and you, in particular with Russia, you've seen a very hands-off for Venezuela. I think that this potentially is part of the larger conversation with let's say Ukraine and Russia and the conflict there, and an agreement that hemispheres of influence for these superpowers be U.S. Western Hemisphere, and I think that's evidenced by the fact that those defense systems that were the anti-air defense systems that were Russian did not activate. The only officers that were really killed were mostly Cuban, right? And so we didn't have the Russian mercenaries that we had seen previously in the country there that day. I think that that's very that highlights the fact that they had started to lose support from the other superpowers in the world that previously upheld this regime, militaristically as well as financially.
So did January 3rd represent the beginning of something more ambiguous?
Yeah, I mean, before, when you think about the regime, it's a terminal condition, right? There was nothing going to change the situation in Venezuela aside from some sort of external military intervention. Now we open ourselves up to many different paths that weren't there before, and it is very ambiguous. And I think that there are a lot of different pathways that could open up here. And I think it's up to both Venezuelans and then obviously the other more broadly international community to kind of shepherd this transition in a way that benefits the Venezuelan people.
So the United States justified the operation under the 2020 narco-terrorism indictments, treating Maduro as a criminal fugitive rather than a head of state. See, that's a defense, right? Does that legal framing hold up? Or did January 3rd set a precedent that any sufficiently indicted leader can be extracted by force?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I'm not a lawyer. I'm certainly not an international lawyer. But I can speak to it from what we tried to do, let's say, as Venezuelan people for many years, which was to use the international institutions to try to invoke change. And so for me, it's very frustrating when I see countries like Colombia, Brazil, Mexico speak out against the US action, but abstain and not even show up to the votes when we discussed at the UN, should Venezuela's dictatorship be defined as a dictatorship? Should they have to prove that they stole the election and show receipts for this? Those countries didn't even show up. They didn't bother to show up in those systems. And so I think that it's both hypocritical when I hear about the international law, when those systems are the ones that failed. And so I would challenge people to think, why would we allow these systems to fail? How can we improve those systems? Instead of putting the fault on the Venezuelans, who are the ones who suffer those consequences of the inactions of others.
You mean the system, you mean the electoral system within the country?
I mean, the international
yeah. Law, because I wasn't aware, or I'm not aware of the international law in determining whether individual government's legitimate. I'm not aware of that kind of law. I'm only aware United Nations Charter stipulation about what conditions that force and threat of force are allowed to use.
Yeah.
So, well, we can discuss that. Maybe our audience have knowledge about international law as far as the legitimacy of a regime or a government. So critics from the left and right have called this violation of international law, an act of war without congressional authorization. So that's internal to the United States. Supporters say Maduro forfeited legitimacy through electoral fraud and narco trafficking. As someone who lived under that regime, how do you weigh sovereignty against the reality of what Chavismo did to Venezuela?
Yeah, for me, Venezuela hasn't been a sovereign nation for many years, given it's been run by a regime that has, a criminal regime that has taken hostage an entire country. And so there's been no sovereignty when we've been when the regime has been using the riches of the country to only focus on preserving power. What I mean by this is giving, let's say, oil at a very discounted rate to Cuba, Iran, China, Russia. And nobody talks about sovereignty in those moments. Nobody talks about the imperialism at those points for the 27 years where those relationships have existed exclusively so that the regime could stay in power and continue to repress people. And so for me, I think it's already been not a sovereign nation for many years, and now we're seeing a course correction in a way by another state actor, in this case, the United States. And so for me, I really can't not support the action itself that at least gets us on a new pathway.
Yeah, the sovereignty issue sounds a little bit like Europe to me, but only Venezuela is under even more pressure because of the sanctions. Yeah, they have to do what they have to do. Well, from the government standpoint, right? So,
they've been the regime itself has been, building its relationships with those nations since the beginning, in particular with Cuba. After the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of Hugo Chavez, Chavez knew that he needed systems to stay in power to continue enacting the policies that would keep them in that state. And so it was both beneficial for the Cuban regime and Chavez to form a deep partnership and provide not only intelligence, but also the tools and the playbook for becoming a repressive authoritarian state. So pre-sanctions, those relationships existed and were the ones that set us into the economic collapse that happened after oil prices plummeted.
Good. So Chavismo's entire identity was built on anti-imperialism, on resisting domination. Yankee. Yeah, that's a good one. Yet its 27-year degradation produced the exact conditions that enabled U.S. military intervention. Do you see an ironic symmetry here? Or did the revolution that promised sovereignty ultimately destroy it?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, for me, the regime and the actions of the state for the last 27 years has put Venezuela in this particular position. And so if we are at the mercy of the United States, it is because of the regime. If we're at the mercy of, prior to this, let's say the huge amounts of loans that we owe now to China, the sort of leverage that countries like Cuba, Russia, Iran had over the country and its assets, is because of the regime itself. And so it is ironic for me to see that this is where we are. We are the furthest thing from sovereign because we're so beholden, not only from a debt perspective, but also from just the absence of any economy or any sense of international importance beyond the oil or things like this.
And Maduro and Chavez before him built deep ties with Russia, China, Cuba, and Iran, as mentioned. Russian weapons, Cuban intelligence, security, Chinese loans and telecom infrastructure, Iranian covert networks. What does the January 3rd mean for those footholds? And has the U.S. actually expelled these rivals from Venezuela, or just inherited a more complicated chessboard?
I think right now it's in a complicated chessboard state. I very much doubt that all of those different aspects of the regime have gone away. And I say this because the repression still exists right now in Venezuela. But the second that you remove the intelligence and the security apparatus that's provided by those other state actors, the regime really loses its ability to repress people, its ability to surveil people, its ability to arrest anybody that they want. And so, you know, that would be my hope, is that through expelling those other actors, we really see the repression go away, because it no longer has the tools to do so, to repress.
So the 2025 National Security Strategy explicitly invokes the Monroe Doctrine and frames the Western Hemisphere as the front line against hostile foreign powers. For Latin American audience, that language carries a lot of historical baggage. How do you think the region reads the January 3rd as the U.S. defending democracy, or as imperialism with updated branding?
I think it's going to be both, and I think that, you know, a lot of these regional actors need to step up now, right? I think if they want to continue to have not only relationships with each other, relationships with the United States and other global trade partners, they need to advocate for a democratic Venezuela. And so I think that it's fine to have mixed opinions about it, and also establish the base facts that this regime does not do the region any favors, and it leaves the region susceptible to imperialism on behalf of the United States, because it will feel threatened directly when other imperial powers, you know, China, Russia, are in that region, right? And so it benefits everyone in the region to advocate for transition to democracy, especially if they're concerned about imperialism, whether it's from, you know, the Eastern Hemisphere or the within the Western Hemisphere.
So imperialism is a loaded word. How do you define? How do you understand the word? Your perspective.
I would say I would view imperialism as any nation, whether their ideology is left or right, using their whether it's military power, economic power, to you know, have enough leverage over a country to shape its policies, to shape its daily reality, right? Every country is going to have some level of leverage over each other, but when you have a one side of the equation that just has so much leverage, it makes it impossible for countries to act independently and with, you know, a let's say standard amount of sovereignty.
So the Cartel de la Solas, the drug trafficking network embedded in Venezuela's military and government. The 2020 indictments framed Maduro as a narco-terrorist, not just a dictator. How does this fit into the broader U.S. posture against cartels, including the conversation about Mexican trafficking organizations and the fentanyl crisis? Is Venezuela one node in a larger hemispheric drug war?
I think absolutely. I mean, I think it's been very clear with this administration that they do want to target the cartels. I think there's been a lot of things way before Venezuela that show this. There was a lot of action that was taken to try to break up the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico. You had one of their, you know, essentially leaders of this federation brought to the United States by one of El Chapo's sons, who kind of kidnapped him, got him on a jet, and flew him into the United States, where he was, you know, arrested by the DEA in Texas. And so you see this sort of fragmenting of the cartels. And I think that Venezuela, the drug trafficking aspect of it, is one node that the United States is going after in terms of, you know, its its view on why these cartels need to go away in order to have a hemisphere that is filled with, productive economic partners and not liabilities that are beholden to, ultra powerful cartels.
The 2025 National Security Strategy talks about nearshoring, moving supply chains from China to Latin America to reduce dependence on adversaries. Some analysts have floated Venezuela as a potential partner. Massive oil reserves, mineral wealth, a workforce eager to rebuild. Is that realistic, or is it a fantasy given how hollowed out the country has become?
I think that's a medium to long-term play. I think step one is obviously getting the region in both state where it can foster that sort of economic growth and partnership, and also begin to restructure a lot of the debt that Venezuela has, to be positioned for that sort of investment as a nearshoring partner. And so I'd be curious to see what happens with, regardless of regime or transition to democracy, how the debt problem is approached, and then how does that set up Venezuela to be a manufacturing partner or a partner in things that are not anything to do with oil and just really with new industries that historically existed there, but just were completely shut down or dissolved in the last 27 years.
Trump's January 3rd press conference, he mentioned oil a dozen times, whereas democracy was treated as an afterthought. Is it Venezuela's tragedy that its oil market, its oil makes it too valuable to be left to Venezuelans?
Yeah, I mean, none of us in Venezuela have benefited from the oil in a very long time, so we're not particularly attached to it. And the metaphor I always use for this is, if you are being held hostage in your house and your neighbor says, I can, kill the kidnappers, but I want to stay with half of your house after that. Are you going to stay under that barrel of a gun indefinitely where we're probably going to have a miserable experience? Or are you going to say, yeah, I don't care. Take 50% of it. I'll figure it out after. So I think that's the perspective for most Venezuelan people based on what has been the reality for the last 27 years. Second to that, I would say the oil focus, I think, is a way for the administration here to sell more domestic policy. And I think it has less to do with what the actual intent is, which is on growing its influence in this hemisphere and the focus in this hemisphere.
The Trump administration now controls Venezuelan oil sales by executive order. Chevron is expanding operations. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party has no seat at the table. What does this tell us about what the U.S. actually wants from Venezuela?
Yeah, I mean, for me, my read on it is that they're pursuing a pathway of stability first and democracy second. And that's a cold reality. If the administration here were to put Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez into power tomorrow, it would most likely result in negative outcomes for Venezuelan people. As much as that's terrible to say, it's a reality for a number of factors. One, I think it would be most likely a violent transition. That would not be good. I think people often look at, or I've had this conversation where people say, oh, why did you, have intervention? Just do it yourselves. And they don't think about it in the way of when other countries overthrow regimes like this, they pay in blood. I think we can look at Iran as a very clear and evident case of that. I'm not sure how many are dead, if the official numbers are accurate or not. We have thousands of people that are obviously dying. You realize that you're telling people that they shouldn't pay for freedom with the assets the country has, but they should instead pay with their blood. And I think that that's a morally bankrupt position to take. And so from the administration perspective, I could understand why they don't want to have a violent transition on their hands, even if that means perpetuating this regime and ultimately working with them. I think for Venezuelans, that's tough to swallow, but it's a reality, right? Every institution is controlled by the regime. So if we now have a democracy, that would require the new government, right? Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez to act democratically. And acting democratically would mean working with a national assembly that is completely full of regime loyalists who are going to shut down every action they take, a Supreme Court that for decades has now been completely full of loyalists. And so it would require them to act undemocratically to actually have any change, or they would be the lamest duck administration ever, right? So even putting aside violent transition, it would just result in Chavismo in power again if we switch to a democracy overnight. And so as difficult as that is, it is the reality of the situation that we need stability first and democracy second.
Some Venezuelans, exhausted by decades of Chavismo, look at vocalists El Salvador and think, maybe that's what we need. Someone who just gets things done, even if not strictly democratic or democratically. Is there something seductive but dangerous about the authoritarian shortcut model for a country as desperate as Venezuela?
Yeah, I think I've seen that play out recently. There has been more far-right authoritarian figures starting to come out of the woodwork in the context of who should lead Venezuela next. And I think that that's trading a red boot for a black boot. And that, it's a difficult situation. I don't think that going to a far right wing authoritarian state would be worse than what we live right now, but it's not the right path. I think ultimately going into a democratic transition eventually and waiting for that is better than having a situation like you saw in Chile with Pinochet, right? You just have a new batch of victims. You just have a new batch of suffering. And so while I would understand why Venezuelans would feel that immediate urge to want to have payback and vengeance, we have to, I think Venezuelan people in particular, need to be very thoughtful about what that would really mean in practice, right? Is that really what we want? If that's what we want, then we can't say that we actually want to be a democracy, right? And I think that that is attractive, but not something that we should fall victim into because it's just moving from one set of unfreedoms to another.
Maria Corina Machado won the Nobel Peace Prize. Won the Nobel Peace Prize for her democratic advocacy, and then advocated for the U.S. military intervention. She just presented her Nobel medal to Donald Trump. How do you reconcile these tensions? Can intervention be a legitimate tool for democracy, or does it fatally compromise the democratic project it claims to serve?
So specifically for the Nobel Peace Prize, it's a political tool and it's being used to try to create influence towards a democratic Venezuela. And so from my perspective, it's a good thing for Venezuelan people. So again, this is similar to the oil, right? These are all the only tools that the Venezuelan people have in order to restore democracy, in order to reduce the amount of human suffering. And so to not use it would be idiotic, to not leverage this sort of political tool that it has. The fact that, I think for me, something that stood out was the speech that was given prior to the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize, where I'm blanking on his name, Jorgen something, said that we're very quick to criticize democratic people who are partnering with figures that we dislike out of necessity, instead of recognizing the fact that people that are fighting for democracies and having a democracy in Venezuela in this case are often choosing between hard decisions and impossible ones, right? What is the alternative that exists, right? You have to have other actors come into this equation if you want to move things forward, if you want to not pay with the blood of the actual Venezuelan people, if you want to not stay in the regime, you need to do something. And in this case, that's a combination of oil, Nobel Peace Prize, all of those things play a role in helping Venezuela transition to a democracy.
How Venezuelans abroad tend toward more radical positions than those who stay. Over time, you learn to numb the pain of distance and to quiet the guilt that comes with leaving. As someone who fled after 2014, how has distance shaped your own politics and writing? Do you feel that hold toward radicalization or toward guilt?
I think it depends on the day. You know, sometimes there's that sense of, I wish we would just have a Bukele come in and arrest all these people and throw them into cells. And I think many of them should go to prison, and there are many criminals that should be brought to justice within the Venezuelan system when we return to democracy. And I think there is a recognition that there are people in Venezuela that would be victims of that sort of radical shift. And so the people that I always think of is, you have real people who have a photo of Hugo Chavez in their home. And the reason they do is maybe not because they support the politics anymore, but because at one point, Hugo Chavez was the only person who they felt in their individual experience that spoke to them on a human level, spoke to them in a way that connected with their background. And so do those people go to prison? If you have a ideological opinion that's different, to me, that's welcome in a democracy. Whether I agree with it or not is besides the point. That someone who did not commit crimes, but just has the Chavismo ideology, they should not face consequences, right? They should not be the ones that are thrown into some jail. And I think that if you go to the far right side of it, it would be more of a purge anybody who has any sort of leftist ideologies. And again, it goes back to, you're just trading one type of authoritarianism for another with a new set of victims, right? Who decides what ideologies are good or bad, right? That's what got us into this mess, and it's not the pathway out of it.
So what does it mean to write about a country we can return to? Do you ever question your authority or legitimacy to analyze Venezuela from abroad?
At times I have. In fact, I didn't really start writing about Venezuela publicly until very recently. I think I felt I would always write to myself on my notes, but I had a real fear. There have been attacks against people outside of Venezuela, and so I had a fear. I had a fear that there would be some sort of repression, and I didn't want to expose myself. But now I feel very differently about that. I think I have a responsibility to not only share my experience, but also to educate people on Venezuela, to educate anybody who wants to listen on not only what the lived experience is, but what decisions put Venezuela where it is today, right?
Venezuelans in Miami flooded streets celebrating Maduro's capture. Meanwhile, Caracas was unusually quiet. Citizens forming long lines at supermarkets, anxious about what comes next. Does it trouble you that the diaspora's hopes and the homeland's fears might be out of sync?
Yeah, it troubles me to the extent that it's evidence of the continuation of the repression. Even now to this day, there are still anywhere from 700 to 1,000 political prisoners being held in torture centers. There are still people who, can and will be arrested for saying anything about Maduro's capture, saying anything about Maria Corina Machado. These are the realities of the people there. From their perspective, they care more about if there's going to be food versus who's in power, right? They're still in that survival state within that context. And so I think that everyone is going to naturally want to celebrate, and Venezuelans, I think, need to also take responsibility for making sure that people in the country are kept safe to the greatest extent that we can, whether it's sharing information about political prisoners or reaching out to people that are in the government here to make them aware of that situation, to continue to put pressure on both the regime and the Trump administration here to ensure that the government stops the repression and frees the political prisoners.
At his January 3rd press conference, Trump and Maria, did I have that question before? Oh, no. Trump and Maria Machado doesn't have the support. Trump said Machado doesn't have the support or respect to lead. Instead, he chose to work with Rodriguez, the Maduro's vice president. How do you explain this extraordinary marginalization of the movement that actually won the 2024 election?
I think it goes back to the focus on stability first and democracy second. It is unfortunate, but it is the reality, and it is not one that is easy to reconcile. And I think the Venezuelan people then have a responsibility to hold this administration here accountable, as well as continue to put pressure on the regime to transition to democracy. And I think that until that happens, we should not blindly accept whatever this administration does, but really advocate for ourselves and make sure that we don't just trust anybody blindly, right? But make our desires known and do that in a way that ensures that the transition to democracy is not so far down the line that we lose sight of people like Maria Corina Machado.
TPS has been terminated for 600,000 Venezuelans. The regime that killed and imprisoned people remains in power, just under new management. When will Venezuelans feel safe to return? Would you return? What would return even mean when so much has been lost?
Yeah, so for me individually, and I think this is most Venezuelans, the day we have freedoms is the day many of us will return. And freedoms are, freedom to express ourselves, the freedom to express ourselves right politically and economically in the country, right? I think that there needs to be assurances to the diaspora that they won't be thrown into torture centers, assurances that their voices will form a part of the new Venezuela. And I think until then, no amount of negotiations with the regime are going to give us confidence that it won't go back to what it's always done, which is to buy time and then repress people.
If this audience takes one insight from this afternoon, what should it be? What does the Venezuelan story teach about authoritarianism and the costs of letting it succeed unchecked?
Yeah, so I'd say one thing would be this comes up a lot, and I get a lot of questions about Venezuela. And sometimes people are looking to me to help shape what their opinion should be. And I'm not one of the people who says, oh, you shouldn't have an opinion or something like this. And I would say those who actually pay the consequences of the opinion or the perspective do have more weight. And so when you're talking to a Venezuelan person who has a certain opinion, right, if they're wrong about their opinion, they are the ones who pay the consequence of being wrong. People outside of the actual experience who are not Venezuelan, who are not in the immediate region, let's say, they don't pay the consequences of being wrong. If we are wrong in that this action on January 3rd isn't better for the country, or is better for the country, if we're wrong about that, we are the ones who pay that consequence, right? And so we have to acknowledge the fact that some opinions are going to have more weight behind them because they do pay the consequences of being wrong or of being right.
So that's all I have from my end, the questioning. It's open to the audience and folks on Zoom. For folks on Zoom, when you want to ask a question, I think you can just speak. Don't forget to unmute, or you can use that function to raise your hand or something. Either way, the key thing is don't forget to unmute yourself. Any questions? Go ahead.
So thank you, first of all. That was really fascinating. I just wonder what's your take about the taking of Maduro, because he is right now out of Venezuela, but his deputy, his vice president, is still there. Were you hoping for something bigger? Because we don't know if that's sufficient, really, right? It might fulfill the US interest of stopping China, stopping Russia from getting over there. But maybe US is just gonna pull out way too soon, even before something for your people is gonna happen for the best, but just enough for the US, to stop Russia and let's say Iran, and that's it. They will go out. Maybe that's not going to trigger any change. So, like, were you hoping for something better, something bigger?
That's a tricky one because I think that something bigger probably results in more civilian casualties, probably results in more of the power vacuum, and so it's tricky. There's part of me that says, just gut it and start over, right, violently. But that has a huge human cost. And so morally, I find it difficult to say that I would advocate for that sort of revolution. When I've looked into this, you look at Spain's transition out of dictatorship or Portugal's transition out of dictatorship. Spain took much longer, and they chose to forget in a lot of ways. Portugal's was more violent. Many people died, but they did transition to democracy faster. So each option has its own cost. Some cases it takes longer, but less human life is lost and less suffering. Some cases it's faster, but it comes at the cost of human life. And so it's tricky for me to say that I wanted more or less. We were happy for anything, any sort of action, anything that gets us a pathway. And I think it was a very, very small amount of, so I think it was 2 civilian casualties. And I think that when you look at US intervention in other cases, that is a very small number. And I think that we can't deny the fact that it was a successful military operation if you just look at it in isolation.
Anyone?
I have
Go
a
ahead.
question. So I would like to know your background, like where you were raised and born and raised in Venezuela, and you came here 2014, you said? Or not?
So I was born in Venezuela, in Caracas. My family moved here when I was a kid. We were here undocumented until 2012. And then we went back to Venezuela. And so then I lived there until 2015 and then moved back here.
Because of the situation?
Yeah, basically.
And then the second question is about the Maria, for example, Machado. And since she dedicated her peace prize to Trump, do you think that he chose Delcy to align with her instead because of to prevent the bloodshed? Or is it like personal interest?
I think I think the incentives are aligned that preventing bloodshed is better politically speaking. So having a very violent sort of transition or a violent taking is bad politically and loses the Republican Party the midterms in November. So do I think that the individuals in power are acting purely out of morality? No, I think that there are incentives behind there's an incentive to act morally in this case, right? And I think as cold as that calculus is, you want your government, in this case, the United States, acting in the best interest of the American people. And I think that that's what they will continue to do. And in some cases, those interests will align with a transition to democracy. And in some cases, it won't. And that's why I think the Venezuelan people have a huge responsibility to not only educate the American public on the Venezuela situation, but also to help shape the politics and where people's perspective on Venezuela shifts to align those incentives so that we do transition to democracy and so that we don't have a perpetual, puppet regime in place.
Anyone? Well, how about people on Zoom? Go ahead, Alicia.
I have a question. History shows that any United States intervention in Latin America didn't work in favor of the people. They make the intervention to protect American companies. Never was the path for democracy. Why do you think that this time will be different?
So I don't think that the US acting in isolation would make it different. I do think that there is an opportunity for Venezuelan people to make it different. I think the onus is on Venezuelan people, and they can do that by doing what I'm doing now and shape the US policy in a way that makes it so that whatever administration is in power, that their incentives align with a transition to democracy. Some of those things come through the economic incentives with swapping, making sure that this regime doesn't stay in power. I think a lot of companies are going to be hesitant to go to Venezuela to do anything without a change of the government. I think that there is a long history of failed intervention. And there's also cases where things have worked out long term, right? Meaning you look at Panama and the situation there. Different situation, but we can say that it was a failure in that case. And I also think Venezuela, and the reality is that, when you think about let's say layers of hell, we're in the 9th layer, okay? If we can get to even the 7th layer, that's better than the 9th layer of hell. So if our 7th layer of hell is to be, under US imperialism and to be, most of our assets, benefiting US companies, that probably is less suffering and more opportunity to live a normal or somewhat relatively normal life than what we live today. And so I would just say the real failure is how, in this case, Cuban, Russian, Chinese, and Iranian intervention has put Venezuela in this position, and not that US intervention is good, but that it's at least the better of two evils, right? We know what the other evil looks like. So that's a difficult reality. And a microcosm of that is there's a lot of people who have now been released from these torture centers. And many of them talk about being tortured and asking to go back to their cell, begging to go back to their cell. And that itself being torture within it, to be tortured so much that you ask to go back into a cell. So I think that if you expand that thinking out, we're asking to go back under US imperialism or under, another form of control by other interests, whether it's US business or US government policy. It's a cold reality, but it's the one that we feel is the only option you have, right? And so as difficult as that is, it's just those are the cards we have to play. We don't really have other ones.
Any questions from Zoom? Okay, I think that begs the question. Hey, who's this?
This is Peggy.
Go ahead, Peggy.
Hi, I wanted to say thank you so much for your talk. It was very informative. And I wanted to know if the response from the people is different versus like the urban areas versus if they're in the rural areas.
So in Venezuela, most of the population is in the capital, so in an urban center. Venezuela in general is highly urbanized society. So even outside of that, most people live in major cities. This has both historically been the case as well as the lack of resources and opportunity that exist in rural parts of Venezuela and the economic collapse have made it so there's not a lot of people that live in the rural side of the country. So I would say, you're probably not going to get a difference in opinion. You'd probably get a more, I guess, happier one in the rural areas. They've been the ones who have had harder times than anybody who's in an urban center, and urban centers have obviously suffered as well. But these rural areas haven't had, medical care. They haven't had food. They haven't had water. They haven't had electricity. They haven't had internet. So I'd imagine that their reality is the worst of the worst, and so they're probably responding accordingly.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh, someone actually sent a message. Well, how do I get the message? Yeah, well, you should be able to click on the, like this one. Is the question there?
Oh, you click on team chat there, the upper center there.
Here,
Yeah.
great. The question's where's everybody?
Oh, well, actually go down to the bottom. You see where it says chat? Sorry, all the way in the bottom row. Not within that window, but back within the
Which one? So
So go back to the speaker.
I want you to go get the mouse.
There we go.
Oh, the chat. Okay, let me read the question. It's from Kelly. Trump clearly didn't have a long-term plan besides taking the oil. He has all the incentive to do nothing and let Venezuelans continue to be a corrupt state. So he can continue to steal the oil and put the dollars, the money in his offshore accounts. American oil companies will not spend billions unless given its US military security and some kind of long-term agreements. None of that leads to a path to democracy. Is that right?
So there's two parts to this. So the first part is there is a long-term plan, and this was public policy from the national what's called National Security Strategy that was published out in November. So the long-term plan is to focus on the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela is part of that equation. So, none of the presidents ever act, entirely alone, right? There's an entire institutions that exist to execute policy, right? So you have, in this case, figures like Marco Rubio. You have, in this case, just in general, the military apparatus that is spending something like $31 million a day with the deployments in the Caribbean. And it's not just for Venezuela, but it's also very clearly for the Western Hemisphere. Specifically for the oil, again, I think that the Venezuelan people, really historically speaking, let's say, when it's gone to other accounts in the world, nobody throws up the flag and says like, hey, that's okay. But when it goes to the US, then suddenly they have problems. And my concern with that is that historically, partnering with the United States has been better for the Venezuelan people than the alternative. And so, at least the United States pays. And I think that the way that they're doing it right now is 100% strategic because Venezuela owes a huge amount of money to many different countries, and funneling it through Qatar and having the U.S. be the one to hold the assets probably benefits the Venezuelan economy, especially from a stability standpoint. We've already seen prices of goods start to drop within the country because of the injection of capital. And if we transitioned, again, going back to the cold calculus of the situation, to a democracy, that wouldn't be possible, right? All of those creditors would want to get paid, and they would be fully in their right to be paid, regardless of who's in charge, right? And so the way that it's being done right now, in the immediate term, is more beneficial to the Venezuelan people than the alternative. And that's evidenced through the fact that prices are stabilizing to a degree, at least right now in the short term. No, the US policy does not necessarily result in a democracy, but it is opening up the possible pathway to a democracy. I think Venezuelan people are accountable for ensuring that occurs. It's really about aligning incentives. And so, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, or ideally a bipartisan agreement, the entire hemisphere benefits from a democratic Venezuela. And if we can get people to align that their incentives with that, then that is the path forward.
Any other questions? Okay, then I have a question. I'm dying to know. What has China done that's evil to Venezuela? Why don't we just go one by one? What has Russia done? What has Cuba done? What has Iran done? What has China done? That's evil. Besides, I get your point. You think they're propping up the Maduro regime. Not for them, Maduro wouldn't be survive, right? Can you give me a little analysis, a little elaborate? And if there are other factors, if there are other evil action or factors, could you give us a list?
So from my perspective, specifically, Chinese policy has probably been the most apathetic and most transactional. They've provided loans. They do this to make, similar to what you would see with the IMF or even with the United States as well, right? They provide you loans that they know you can never pay back, and then hold you, but keep you beholden to them, right? And so this is classic imperialism, right? Where your entire country is so in debt to them that they really shape your policies and how you invest and who you allow to build certain things. And so Chinese influence has been more similar to what the US does historically, right? It's been more financial in nature, and not what you've seen with Russia or Cuba, which has been more of, we will provide you the tactics and playbooks to repress your people in order to keep you in power, because it benefits us both from an ideological standpoint and from a military standpoint to have a country that's aligned with our interest in the Western Hemisphere. Specifically for Cuba, after the fall of the Soviet Union, they needed a new Soviet Union to maintain their own regime and their own control over their people. And so they enabled Chavez and the entire let's say military part of it, with the knowledge and know-how of, this is how you create repression, this is how you do propaganda, this is how you create these different systems that we really perfected in authoritarian Cuba. Similarly, Russia provided, through this thing called, the Wagner Group, right, where they provided training and intelligence on how to torture people. They provided how to find political dissidents and silence them. All of that has been provided by those state actors, right? Weapons and tactics for repression that they have, done in their own countries.
What do they get in return, like Russians?
Well, one, they get a country that's in the in the Western Hemisphere, kind of in their, under their influence, let's say, right? And so it's a military, it's a strategic military.
Sticking into to the US.
Correct. And then two, they do get oil. They get discounted oil.
Well, does Russian have their own oil wells?
Absolutely, but
So why
having
do they need
strategic
actual oil?
control, but so does the US.
No.
All I'm
So
saying is it's
control of
strategic
the oil
control.
market, like
Absolutely.
more control.
Yeah, more control over, more control over these assets is good for any superpower. Everyone's going to
It's
want.
leverage.
Absolutely.
So you said China signed loans with Venezuela that they know can never be paid back.
They pay in.
What makes you
oil.
say that? What makes you say that?
What
Do you
makes
know the details, some kind of detail or the contents of the loan agreement that supports your assertion
So
that it can never be paid back, that Chinese know that it will never be paid back?
I think the amount outstanding right now in total debt is something like $180 billion, which even back in 2004, which was the last time that there was any sort of independent review of Venezuela's economy, would represent, of 2004 figures, 200% of GDP. So there's just a huge amount of debt, period. Most of that debt is owed to China. These are loans that are, the way that they're paid back is through oil. So historically, I think they were maybe doing at the peak, I want to say 20, I could look on my phone, my notes on this, but during the Chavez years, when we were still doing a decent amount of oil output, of the 450,000 barrels that were going out, 360,000 of them were going to China just to try to repay the debt. And when you looked at that over the long term, you would, come to the fact that, oh, we are never repaying this debt because the amount of oil that we're giving is not enough to offset the amount of interest that's piling up on those loans.
Interesting. Yeah, it's 2004 number. Would you think if they reassess that in 2025 or 26 will be a little bit different? Will be more favorable in the time for Venezuela or less favorable? I'm just
Yeah, less favorable,
Less
less
favorable,
favorable, yeah.
Okay, well,
Right now, I at the bottom of this, right, we went from when the country had 7 million people only, we were doing about 3 million barrels a day, okay? We now have 35 million Venezuelans in the world, 8 million live in the diaspora. We do 150,000 barrels. So that shows the collapse of the oil infrastructure.
yeah, you think it's a conspiracy theory or it's a rumor, like that's because it's hard for me to grab the decline of the productivity in the oil industry in Venezuela. It's kind of counterintuitive. Of course, I'm not an expert in oil, but I know a lot of things. And my gut tells me there's something else. What I hear is there's some sabotage movement or action from the US to hurt the Venezuela in the oil industry to make them in an even deeper trouble. Do you think how credible that is, that kind of storyline?
So for me, when you look at the historical events, here's a truth of that situation. In 2002, there was a coup against Chavez, and he was out of power for about 48 hours and then returned to power after that. And from that moment onwards, his focus was very much on consolidating power in the executive branch. And famous when the PDVSA, which is the state oil company, when the PDVSA employees in 2002, 2003 went on strike, he famously fired all 18,000 employees. Okay, So when it comes to a productivity fall, and some of them are still in prison right now, people from those times. Many of them went into exile, but some of them are political prisoners still to this day. When you have the filling of the entire system with loyalists, and that set of loyalists is a kleptocracy, you're going to get an eventual collapse like we've seen over the last 27 years. So, from a sabotage perspective, you just look at the brain drain, you look at the where the incentives lie, right? Why would somebody who actually knows about the industry want to work at PDVSA? They don't. Because if you don't say yes to everything, if you question anything, you might go to jail. You most likely will be fired. And so, you see what similarly happened throughout the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? You can only ignore the hard truths for so long before, shit really hits the fan, right? And that's certainly what happened in Venezuela.
How, in that situation, how come the Russians didn't send some experts, oil experts? The Russians are very productive in their own oil industry, right? And the Chinese, they learn everything, right? Why couldn't they send some experts to fill the gap, at least for a while? How come it didn't happen? Well, I don't know if it happened. So can you?
For me, this is speculation. I would assume that would not be favorable to, number one, the US would probably see that as an escalation of influence from those state actors, right? And when they already have a lot going on with the Ukraine war, I think that it's probably not beneficial for them to have a focus on the Western Hemisphere. So from a Russia perspective, I just think that it would not benefit them, bigger picture, geopolitically
Yeah,
speaking.
that's a good point. How about the Chinese? They build railroad from coast to coast, from Atlantic coast to Pacific coast, through Brazil to Peru. They build the biggest port in South America.
Yeah.
How come they couldn't send someone to support the Venezuela's infrastructure for their oil industry?
My assumptions there would be, the kleptocracy is very powerful. And, you can bring in people to try to help. And I think there has been a lot of those cases. But, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And in the case of Venezuela, you can bring all these people in, it'll stick for a minute, and then people go right back to stealing, which is what the entire government and all its institutions did and have been doing, right? These people have just stolen an astronomical amount of money. And so, it's just, yeah.
Okay. As
Without China then controlling every aspect of the
Right.
country, right?
Right.
Which is like, okay, that's a huge investment, number one, and number two, does it get us?
That's very
is
possible,
Is
yeah.
is the juice worth the squeeze? I
Maybe
guess?
they try and they fail. It didn't to no effect, maybe. And so maybe Chevron or ExxonMobil, they came in, they can probably do a better job to clean it up.
It's very funny because for the first time in probably 27 years, I would be willing to bet, you see videos and they've started to clean the PDVSA buildings themselves. And you see them pressure washing and cleaning everything because they're expecting, people to come and look at things and assess it, and they have to make it look good. And it's just like, wow, you went from having in the 90s, the best, state-run oil enterprise in the world to, this just depressing sight, and now you see the complete reversal, and it's just like it's upsetting. I think for me at least, I won't say for many Venezuelans, I don't know, but for me it's upsetting to see you could have been doing this the entire time and you chose not to. You chose to steal, you chose to repress, but you had within your power to do these things, these basic things, and you just cared only about your self-interest and the short-term thinking. And now, again, I go back to what I said earlier. If we're beholden to these other countries, it's because of the regime and its decisions. They had it within their control when Chavez took power to do good things with whatever their ideology was. They chose to not. They chose to turn the country into kleptocracy. They chose to erode the entire democratic process. They chose to destroy trust in the institutions. Those were decisions they made. So if we're beholden to the United States or any other nation, it's because of those decisions.
And we have some input from Scott Smith. He said Iran actually sent a significant number of petroleum engineers to Venezuela to fill the gap that Eric is referring to, which, as you might imagine, raised a significant amount of attention in Washington.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's kind of,
Well, and this would be my guess. If China were to send and increase productivity of the oil fields in Venezuela, that would probably be seen by the United States as a next step towards invading Taiwan, which would be a massive, amount of oil needed to carry out a long-term occupation or, taking of Taiwan. So again, moving those pieces would force other actors to view it as part of something else, right? And that is most likely why you see, a hesitation from those other actors to not do more than what they were doing, and why China had more of a transactional relationship with the regime. I think they don't really care who's in power. And sure, it's nice to have this regime that's sympathetic and gives you discounted oil, but I don't think ultimately that China cares too much, and that's shown in their response to all of this. They kind of like pay us back our money,
yeah, I think it's in a way, it's a good for a foreign country to be agnostic about who's in
Absolutely.
charge in that country. So when we say not care, seems like China is cold-blooded, but if you use the word agnostic, China is very democratic in a way, as opposed to some countries that cares too much about who's in charge in another country. I don't think it's in that country's fortune to have that.
Yeah,
on
I mean,
their
they're
back.
selling oil to China right now, just not at the price that they
market
had
price,
before.
just like the Russians are doing too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the Scott gave us a very good point. I think what we can imagine is Iran, they have nothing else to lose. The China has something to lose, like you said, they may don't want to get into too much into this hemisphere in that way. To ruin the relationship with the US on other end, it's probably not worthwhile for them to do that. But Iran has nothing to lose. They've already been bombed, or they expected to be bombed. So they could send engineers, and I'm sure the government at the time in Caracas, they requested that, right? Because that helped them.
Yeah,
Yeah, like you said, why haven't they done that all along? Why waited so long, right? That's another factor, another dimension of the thing.
yeah, I mean, it's a shame and it's a waste, right? The peak of Venezuela's when oil prices were very high throughout the early and mid 2000s, all of that money was really stolen, right? The Chavez, who famously said, being rich is evil, well, his daughter is worth $4 billion. I don't know how much has been seized at this point. But that's quite ironic when you have someone who clearly did not come from a wealthy background or anything like this, but has that much, money, right? And you just see these seizures and the amount of money that's starting to magically pop up all over these places on a global scale. It's just a shame that money was stolen, right? Because it could have been setting up Venezuela more in this 21st century for a better future. And instead, we got what we got now.
Yeah, it wasn't investing in people.
Right, exactly.
Not
Yeah.
enough, very little, but investing in himself and his
Yeah.
power circle.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's just stolen, just stolen.
So what do you envision as the best kind of economic arrangement for Venezuela in the longer term to get out of this predicament that it is in right now?
They need to arrive at a way to restructure the debt. My concern would be that we transition to a democracy, and in that democracy, the first government has to foot that bill, right? For 27 years of mismanagement, someone's got to pay that, right? And I think that, again, ideology will come into play here because you're going to have a lot of austerity you need to have policies that are going to look very austere, right? You're going to have someone who says, whoever it is in the Democratic thing, we can't have any social programs because we don't have the money. And the headlines will say, we told you, as soon as they got into power, they were going to take all the money away from poor people and all of this stuff. When in reality, the last regime or the 27 years of mismanagement put them in this position where now that is the measures that are needed, right? There's going to be a period of reconstruction. And I think that the dangerous thing is people who are still facing difficult times and difficult realities will take it out on the people focused on rebuilding the country instead of realizing that, you know, they're having to pay the price of the previous regime. And it's not that these measures are ideal, but they're just the realities of the situation.
The austerity,
Well, just sort of
the other way around,
the other way around, right?
and more benefits.
Well, you know, they're going to have to do significant cuts, right, across the board. Who knows how, right? And so that somebody will need to come up with an economic plan for Venezuela, right?
What about
Venezuela
the-
will need to decide how they want to grow the economy long term, and that probably initially will be a shock to the system.
Yeah, and initial is the hardest part. Go ahead.
Do you think the current government will be able to do that?
I think right now,
Especially, sorry.
Go ahead.
Especially, you know, she was the vice president, so they had the same ideology, right? So do you think that she's gonna be able to lead the Venezuelan people into that prosperity? And on the other hand, the second half of the question, how hopeful are the Venezuelans with this government?
I mean, I don't have any, they're being forced to do anything they're doing right now, and they have the incentive to make things look decent. In fact, we saw this before during the Biden administration, where the sanctions came up, and we did absolutely see some level of normalization. We could actually flirt with the idea of going back, even if it's just to see family or things. It's kind of like a quiet period almost. Then you have 2024 and everything changes, and you see the repression state in full force after, you know, people overwhelmingly voted against the regime. So I don't think anybody has hope that this government has their best interest at heart. In particular, you know, Maduro, probably not the person with the most power at any point in Venezuela. You know, the figures right now there, Diosdado Cabello, Delcy Rodriguez, Jorge Rodriguez, they're long-term architects that came from the Chavez days. Maduro has been there as well, but architects of the system is the Rodriguez siblings and people like Diosdado Cabello, Padrino Lopez, who runs the military. You know, these are people who really put the whole thing together and kept it running. Delcy Rodriguez, in fact, one of her personal biggest accomplishments that she has stated is setting up the Helicoide, which is Latin America's largest torture center. So this is the kind of people we're dealing with. You know, their father famously was he kidnapped Americans in Venezuela, and he was captured by the Venezuelan military and then was tortured to death. And so their history is in this revolution. They fundamentally hate the United States. So I don't believe that they're going to change what their entire life narrative has been, right? They are true ideologues, Rodriguez, and they're intelligent, right? These are people who have the mental wherewithal to persist this regime, and they will do whatever the United States says because they know that it gets them to preserve power and buy time.
Thank you.
I think you guys I think you just answered the question there, like you talked about democracy and stuff like that. So if you think about Trump, he just doesn't care about the people himself. I mean, there's like 28 million people live there and he don't care. He wants to keep it stable.
Yep.
he just need resources. He need oil and stuff like that. So he's just gonna keep it the way it is right now. So he's not gonna change anything. So whatever the vice president who became like a president now, she's probably gonna stay. As long as she's gonna do whatever he told her to do.
Yeah.
So it's pretty much nothing gonna change. You just change the hands there. So,
One thing that is changing, and again, this is just the cold reality, you know, because of how the money is being managed by the United States, people are actually finally starting to see that money. Do we love that the people in power are still in power? No. But is it good that people are seeing prices stabilize? Yes. You know, the fact that there's going to be some level of predictability in the economy is a net good thing for people that have suffered economically for the last 27 years with that uncertainty. And so I go back to the incentives need to be aligned so that having this regime in power is not beneficial to stability. Some of that might happen internally. My suspicion is that, you know, they at the top can keep this act going for a long time. But at some point, you know, there's a entire apparatus that has built their lives around the kleptocracy that are going to not be happy with the fact that they can't steal this money, the fact that they can't, you know, wield as much power as they used to. And so that it kind of becomes a maybe gradual shift, or it could be a you know, a pressure bomb that goes off where you have somebody who tries to coup this current government and things like that. So yeah, I mean, there's just like a lot of possibilities there, right? But I don't think that the US itself wants to be more involved than they need to be, right? They want to preserve US interest, and they don't want Americans to die in Venezuela. I think that's very, very clear. So I don't know, my recommendation would be to have whatever faction of the military arrest some of these other figures, and then potentially, you know, slowly disband the military in hopes that you don't have, you know, guerrilla groups pop up out of that. But it's a potential pathway. I don't know.
but like, if you think about like, if US will take all the resources from Venezuela, would the people still be happy if there's a democracy? Like, you know, they're just like, okay, we're free, we can speak whatever we want, we can do business, and but the resources doesn't belong to the people anymore.
Yeah.
So would that make you happy? Was it the country gonna be like, you know, like happy about it? Or they just gonna say, no, you know what, this is our resources, we want it back, we wanna control them, we wanna sell them, we wanna be able to do whatever we want with them? Or they just gonna say, you know what, okay, US, keep the resources, everyone's gonna be happy without democracy.
I would say it would be the latter, you know, again, you either pay for the freedom in blood or you pay for it with resources. Venezuela cannot depend on oil in any scenario long term. When we were at the peak again, we only had 7 million citizens, right? We're not going to return to that. And I think that most Venezuelans acknowledge that, right? The time to use oil to create this wealth and all this is over, right? It's time to look at other industries. It's time to expand our thinking. And most people could care less about the oil because they haven't seen it in the day-to-day life, right? In fact, up until literally this week when they injected the $300 million from the first sale, I mean, we're kind of using this term and saying, oh, the US is taking the oil. The US is paying for it and helping them sell it. And they did what they said they were going to do. And that money did go into the economy. And as long as they continue to do that, it's good for the Venezuelan people. We don't care if they're keeping half of it. I mean, half is more than zero, which is what it was before. And all the dollars are being tracked through the US SWIFT system. So we know that where the money's being spent, which we didn't before. So, you know, yeah, we'd be happy if the US said, hey, none of your oil is yours anymore. It's all ours, but we're going to have you be a democracy. Venezuelans would gladly take that. At least I think it would be a very logical thing, right? We can't couple our identity to an asset, right? An asset doesn't buy you the ability to, you know, go to your country and not be a victim of torture or repression, or the ability to, you know if you're going to have your next meal, right? Like, what is it? Maslow's laws of what is it? Needs or whatever it is, right? Like, just basic human existence will always come first before saying, well, we care about oil.
What I see is like my observation actually, just, I mean, maybe just like, not in detail. But a lot of time I see like when the United States in their history, when they put a sanctions on somebody, it's a global sanctions. It's not just like the United States cannot deal with the United States, it's a global. Because especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, now it became a unipolar world. So if you sanction under the United States, that means nobody can deal with it anymore.
Yeah.
That's it, you're done. So, and when you were talking about like why Venezuela were dealing with China, with Russia, Iran, I mean, all those countries you're listing, they also oppose the United States.
Mhm.
So, and if I remember correctly, I mean, I might be wrong, but in Venezuela, the oil is actually, I think it's like called a heavy oil.
Yes.
First of all, it's hard to extract.
Yeah.
It's deep and stuff like that. Plus, there's a lot of chemicals in it.
Yeah.
So once you extract it, you have to like refine it.
Yep.
So before that, I think US owned some of the stuff in there. So they were actually extracting it and they were sending it to the United States where they reproducing, refined that stuff and they were selling. And then when US put sanctions in there was no way to send them anymore. So now they will start sending it to Russia, to Iran, so they can refine that stuff with that oil. So that's why, because it's like Venezuela, I mean, it's just like they had no choice because US is just sanctioning them all over the world. So now they said, you know what? Either you just give up your sovereignty, give everything we want, just open the doors for us and we'll take everything from you. Or they had no choice just to deal with other countries in there. So at least they were getting some finances, some money, some kind of like I mean China, they were kind of like exchange maybe for the food, for the business, for something in there. But when we were asking why the China and Russia never invested so much, because well, first of all, it costs a lot of money to invest into like especially now when you see like a Trump, he's talking about hundreds of billions of dollars being invested now for those companies from the US just to rebuild the infrastructure. But those companies, they're not just rebuilding it for free.
Yeah.
They're just investing it so they can get all the resources, all the money in there. I mean, maybe there's some percentage of course going to go to Venezuela, just 10, 20%, who knows how much, whatever, it's going to be their decision in there. But we have to remember the US is a capitalist country. It's all about profits.
Yeah.
The company, the corporations, they care about profit. They don't care about the people. They care about the profits.
Absolutely.
So I'm pretty sure they're not going to give much to Venezuela's people. Even though maybe it's going to be easier now because if they remove the sanctions, now maybe they can get all the products from all over the world cheaper. Maybe they can do the business better, but who would actually invest into Venezuela there? Like why the other country would invest in it? I mean, what for?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it goes back to the fact that those partnerships with those countries existed way before sanctions were even on the table. They came out of ideological alignment as well as the beneficial trade, right? The relationship in particular started with Cuba and Venezuela, right? What did the government want? It wanted the tools and tactics to remain in power. In exchange, then they would give Cuba, this oil. And so the history there is way before sanctions. And again, you go back to the base reality. The situation right now has been if we're just looking at oil, that the oil has been going to then support a kleptocracy where none of that money is seen by the citizens. So even if the next situation is that we still don't get any of the oil money, but we have the freedom to live in our country, well, we gained something there. We went from having nothing and also being repressed to having nothing but not being repressed.
What if it's going to be still repressed? If everything is just continue to be the same thing, you just change the hands of the owner of the oil.
Yeah,
but everything is going to be the same. I mean, you're going to see, still going to see that Nelson Rodriguez, still going to be the president, still going to be repression, still going to be everything the same because the corporation who's coming in, they don't care about the people. So they said, okay, you know what? You worked before, just keep it. It's just because you're protecting so people don't revolt, they don't go, they didn't do anything. That's the only thing they care about. So, and then we'll take the resources. That's it. I mean, so everything is going to continue exactly the same way.
It's possible. I don't think it's the most likely outcome because of the incentives that the United States has, financially speaking, beyond oil. Because again, even right now on today's, rate, that oil is not super economically viable to begin with because of the cost to extract and refine. And so with the current price of oil, it has more to do with strategic control, which goes back to what is the national security strategy that this administration has put forth. It's put forth that they want democratic allies in this region and they want to reduce the influence of other powers, right? And so with that means it's less about the oil and it's more about creating long-term options for if we have to cut ties with China, do we have people in the region that we can rely on for our manufacturing needs that have a lower cost of, of goods that we can import from? And if you don't have a democracy, you don't invite investment, then you don't have those partners. Right now you look at Mexico's government. Mexico's government is very much driven, and the politicians within it are driven by the cartels. Cartel money is heavily invested in the Mexican political system. This is of concern to the United States. You can't have negotiations with the government that's beholden to a criminal enterprise, right? Same is true with Venezuela. And so why I say it's not likely is that it's not about the oil. It's more about what having strategic control has in creating opportunities for nearshoring in the inevitability that we, have to just focus on this hemisphere and can't get things from China anymore because they invade Taiwan or whatever the case may be. And so I think that, if you look at what they've said on the books, they want to focus on in this hemisphere, it leans towards a democratic process happening in Venezuela at some point.
It's important that, go ahead.
No, I'm no expert on Venezuela by any means, but I mean, I hear a lot of positive, outlook from you, despite what history showed us about the United States and their involvement in anything. I think I hear it a lot from the activities here that it's hard to believe.
Yeah, I mean, again, when you are in that ninth layer of hell, you have to
Yeah.
move somewhere.
US create a hell around you, and then you said, you know what, whatever, I'm gonna do whatever you want, but just get rid of the hell in there, so.
I mean,
They
it's,
didn't create the hell. All the situation of Venezuela was, and 100%, fabricated by the Venezuelan people. They democratically elected Chavez. They did democratically attempt to then reverse that. We're not allowed to do it because of the constitutional crisis that Chavez pushed that allowed them to remove term limits, allowed them to consolidate power in the executive branch. And I know for many of you here, this sounds very familiar, but people like Chavez and Trump, they meet, right? These are people who want, and regardless of who comes next, want to consolidate power while they're in that position of power, not thinking about how that might erode democracy. So, it's easy to go and say, oh, it's, Russia or the US's fault or whatever. This is the Venezuelans. They made these decisions. These are Venezuelan leaders who chose to act immoral. They chose to turn the country into a criminal enterprise. Those are the decisions by the Venezuelan people. And we, like Venezuelan people, are fully accountable for it. And then are also fully accountable for changing it as well.
and you made a good point about the sanctions, or you made a good point of sanctions. Because I remember not that long ago, when Syria, Assad regime fell. Okay,
You can.
well, you need to be here to respond. Okay, let's play some music and when he's done.
So what is what's the deal with the new administration in Venezuela? My understanding is that Trump said that, what's her name, the young woman who got the Nobel Peace Prize?
Machado.
Machado was not a viable person to put in charge.
That's Trump's assessment.
Yes.
I think he has reason to believe that. He doesn't just say it.
Well, yeah, that was his assessment, and then he also said that Rodriguez was more viable.
Yeah, she's a deep state, so to speak.
He needs control, he needs to control the country right now.
He doesn't want chaos.
Because,
Trump doesn't want chaos.
because he's trying to bring the corporations who are gonna invest a lot of money. So he needs to make sure that the money is not gonna disappear. they're not gonna, like, the people not gonna revolt. change
Trump
it.
has
So
responsibility.
he wants to bring those corporations, and he wants to control the country
Right.
completely. So-
Chaos is the last
So
thing you want.
there's, how much, gold is in London and how much, T-bonds were outed? And how, are they going to be returned now? Because.
I don't know. You have to ask, someone else.
Well, I mean, it's curious, they have, because,
Or the man is bad.
yeah, because obviously Maduro was not elected and not accepted by the US. And Guaido, of course, was elected by Venezuela. All that money was Guaido's because he was the elected.
Yeah, hold that thought, hold
President,
that thought, hold that thought. Let's continue, like, finish up the train of thought, then we get back to it.
Okay,
So you made a good point about sanctions. This is global. It's the US has sanctioned on you, you will not allow anyone doing business with, unless you want to
Yeah.
openly define
Cuba is another
the
person.
US, right?
Yeah, Cuba is another.
I remember not that long ago, when Syria's Assad regime fell, the Syrians, the diaspora, all the opposition or dissent to the government, first thing they want US to do, or US Congress to do, is lift all the sanctions. So I think of, because this is consequential, the effect of the sanctions is global. So I would think that Venezuela people or Venezuela government should request US lift all the sanctions to make, that probably have an effect to make Venezuela's people's condition almost instantaneously better. So that's one thing. I haven't heard that. Maybe I didn't pay enough attention. Have you heard of any request or any voice from Venezuela or diaspora for US to lift all the sanctions on the country?
No, because it enables the regime.
The regime is not okay.
Because here's the problem. This is how it works in Venezuela. When you had the oil prices collapse towards the end of the early 2000s, they could no longer afford with the money from the oil to import goods, and because the government, the regime had chosen to nationalize everything, and most importantly, not actually build anything with that money, but instead steal it, evidenced by the properties owned by the people in the regime, evidenced by the fact that Chavez's daughter is worth $4 billion, evidenced by the fact that Maduro has God knows how much gold that turned up in Switzerland, right? So they chose to nationalize these entire sectors: agricultural, electric, what is it called? Manufacturing. All these things were nationalized, and they would say, we're going to give this minister of agriculture, $300 million to build the greatest agricultural, infrastructure the world has ever seen. They never did it. They never did it. They stole the money. So then what happens? Oil prices collapse. No sanctions. This is just naturally oil prices collapsed, right? Supply and demand market. You can no longer import food. And me, myself, living there, saw when the shelves emptied out because there was no money to import the food into the country. That had nothing to do with sanctions. And then the government turned around and said to the very few national producers that still existed, that were still producing food, that they were responsible, that they had been hoarding and not scaling on purpose to make the government look bad. Even though if you grew too big in Venezuela, they would expropriate and take your country and take your entire company. I used to sell pizzas, okay? Now, here's some crazy logic. When I would buy flour to make pizza, if I bought 1 kilo of flour, it cost less than if I bought 5. Doesn't make any sense. Usually when you buy in bulk, it's cheaper. Not in Venezuela. Because the distributor who sells you the flour needs to bribe the government official who tracks how much they sell. Because if they sell too much and get too big, they're going to take their company. So the entire situation, the empty shelves, the lack of medications in the country was because of the decisions of the regime to hollow out the country and steal the money. This all happened before any sanctions. These are the consequences of a country who chose to create the conditions for an economic collapse, who put individual self-interest ahead of their responsibility to build an economy that lived beyond oil, because they would just have this expectation that oil prices will always stay high. And when that went away and the tide went back out, they were caught with no underpants.
Okay, so the question is, what's the point of sanctions then? I mean, what's the point for them? And plus those sanctions, did they hurt the heads of the regime
Yes,
or they hurt the people? Who actually hurt the most? Because I think, like you said, the older billions in there, they don't care. I mean, there's only a couple of people on top, and if they get billions, who cares? I mean, I have 4, 5, 10 billions, whatever. Or the regular.
well, this is why the sanctions didn't work. The sanctions.
But why
did not work.
they even US impose those sanctions?
I think it's the first step before going and saying, we're gonna go and take a more direct action. The plan to force either by military action or by sanctions, the Maduro and more broadly Chavez regime started in 2011 when Barack Obama opened the first indictments against actually Nicolas Maduro, who was the vice president at the time, because of the amount of corruption and because there was a real concern that there could be national security situations that come out of the fact that a criminal enterprise is running a country that's so close to the United States, that's so, sympathetic to people who would love to see America lose its position as one of the superpowers, right? And so these things started way before anything with this administration. And I think the sanctions are a first step, right? It's the natural first step. You don't go in and just, capture Maduro or capture, whoever without taking some other steps first. And they hurt the regime as well, right? But they clearly did not hurt them enough that they lost, their overall power in the country.
You know what I don't like the most is that US decides like what they're gonna do. They like this or they don't like that, so they kind of impose their views on everybody. I mean, if we like extract US from all this, it's the Venezuelan people. They have to decide what they want to do. If they don't like that, they'll actually revolt, change, whatever. US shouldn't be there involved at all. They shouldn't be just sitting in the US thinking about the people of the US.
Here's the problem with
Without
that.
any sanctions or telling what kind of president, what kind of regime you need to have and stuff like that, who needs to control the resources.
But
it's your resource, it's your people resources. Once the US they have to deal with it.
Here's the problem with that. Morality is a luxury afforded by the powerful. And if the US is not acting like a superpower, then somebody else will. And I've never lived in China, I've never lived in Russia. But whoever's in power is the one who sets the moral code. And for all of its flaws, I'd rather have the US be setting the moral code than what I know to be an authoritarian state like China, or what I know to be an authoritarian state like Russia. So, as a preference of which evil do I want to, rely on, I'll rely on the United States. And historically, that has been.
You mentioned China many times, I have to say something.
No, I mean,
I'd rather have Chinese to make moral code for China, not the United States.
yeah.
So if you want to favor United States making moral code for Venezuela over Venezuelans, because the recent history, you lost faith of the government, at least the deep state, you can keep it at that, okay? We don't want to get expanded to the larger to China or Russia, other countries.
Well,
That's a sad situation
let
in
me-
Venezuela, may
Right.
not exist in Russia or China.
But here's the problem. Ideal
It's
state.
down, but they,
Ideal
but they
state.
will have this problem. It's just a matter of time.
Well, we'll see. You wanna bet on that?
Ideal state is
Oh, I'll bet on that.
Venezuelans have complete
You
sovereignty.
got it.
Ideal state, Venezuelans have complete sovereignty. Then there's realities. Okay? And then those realities make us have to force us to make difficult decisions. It's not that I want that. But it's what other choice do I have?
I mean,
Yeah, we got it.
If
I was just
if I
objecting
don't
to,
do anything,
I was
yeah.
just objecting to, I totally get it. And I appreciate all the analysis, all the possibilities and unknowns.
Yeah,
I totally
absolutely.
appreciate that. I was just objecting, let me finish. I was just objecting to using that logic on other countries who are in totally, well, I won't say in totally very different situations. So another thing is because you keep mentioning the democracy, you seem to very, well, you're not alone. You favor democracy, you think it's a very good system. So I would, but it's important. Well, I can't dispute that. It's your belief and people's beliefs are different. But I do want to dispute that it's important that we don't misinterpret the US national security strategy because US Trump administration has explicitly said, we don't want to hold on to ideology anymore. It was a mistake in the past that do the ideological line. Now he wants to abandon that in terms of cooperating with countries with a different system, including Middle Eastern monarchs,
Yes.
right? So you can't say US want to help Venezuela to restore democracy, and that's not the objective.
No.
That's totally not in the picture. That's totally not in the picture. And Trump, I might add, we can also observe is very conscious of cost, and he's very aware of the work pipeline. That's why he wants to keep his involvement in Venezuela to the minimum.
But there is.
So combine that with democracy is not his objective. So he wants to, and we'll go back to the national security strategy. The big picture is US considers Western Hemisphere the United States hemisphere. They want to exclude or drive out outside powers. That's explicitly in the national security strategy. So that's their objective in their action to drive out at least get Maduro out. So we can't ask for more than that one. So the Trump administration's objective on Venezuela, we don't want to ask more than that. Ask more than that is your wishful thinking.
Yeah.
If one American does American thing, they do it for their own strategy.
Yep.
Other than that, it's your wishful thinking. We can base it's not like a solid basis for any kind of analysis.
Yeah.
Which is, Trump has accomplished that to a certain degree, to a large degree in Venezuela by abducting Maduro. By leaving the rest of Maduro's administration in place, he's watching if China will come back. If China comes back, then Trump will take further action. If not, or Russia for that matter, Trump will leave it at that, based on his national security strategy.
Yeah.
Right, with regard to Venezuela.
The difference here is, unlike the monarchs, let's say in the Middle East, especially the ones that are now in power, they're ideologues, number one, and they're criminals. So they're criminal ideologues. That means that the US has to maintain a tighter grasp on them to get them to stay aligned with US incentives. They would not have to do that with a democratic Venezuela. Why? Because historically, Venezuelan people, and certainly now, would probably land center-right on the political spectrum as a US American would understand it. They would likely land somewhere center-right. So with that means less babysitting, less investment from the US, and less risk long-term that you're not going to return to what you have today. If these people in power were just part of some dynasty or monarchy or something like this, very different situation. Very different situation. But these are just criminal ideologues.
Yeah, I think I can understand you.
That's
That
why,
line is
for me, I would
logical.
argue that there's a much higher cost for the US babysitting this regime than an eventual transition to
Well,
democracy.
what's the cost of babysitting the regime?
They don't have to babysit the monarchs in the Middle
What's
East.
the cost? You said cost. What's the
Military.
cost?
Intelligence, They have to make sure that they're not back channeling to stab them in the back, because at the end of the day, like I've mentioned, Delcy Rodriguez and Jorge Rodriguez directly blame the United States for, the murder of their father who kidnapped Americans. So obviously that did not end well for him. Their entire life has been to get revenge on the United States. So it goes beyond like aligning incentives, right? It's not some monarch who
Right,
is
they have a
benevolent
personal,
leader. They have a real
grudge.
personal
score
personal
or
thing here.
something, they have the propensity to disobey
And,
US is.
and they're ideological, they are ideological, people.
But I beware of the, or it can take into consideration your being favorite of, the democracy, because, to me, it's a little bit it's also ideology. You're saying the other side is
But
ideological.
remember,
So on the
I-
same level, you're ideological too.
well, so I've actually written about this recently. It would be, if we went to a far right dictatorship, objectively speaking, we would be in a better position. Would that be ideal? No. But would it objectively be better in aggregate? Yes. But I still want democracy. I'd rather wait for democracy than them install some far right dictator who comes from the military and, just starts rounding up people from the previous regime to, kill everybody regardless of if they committed crimes.
I can understand.
So, this is my ask up here, right? Which is like, hey, a democracy means the lowest amount of human suffering from just that perspective. And then there's an entire spectrum in there of things that.
There are examples, a counterexample to that. I can understand that. That's ideal. I would like to see that happen. It's totally possible. But I can also see tragedies in other countries like Iraq, like Syria to be seen. What's the other country that came to mind?
Their oppositions were armed and divided religiously, ethnically. You don't have that in Venezuela.
Libya, well, okay.
We only have one armed group, and that's the regime.
Is Maria Machado the opposition leader perceived as somebody who stands for democracy, or does she stand just for a different kind of totalitarian regime?
She stands for democracy. There is other people that stand for far right authoritarianism. In fact, people like Roger Stone and I'm blanking on the name here, Steve Bannon have come out in support of this guy called Eduardo, who says we need a Bukele-style government times 1,000. We need someone who comes in and just by military action, a civic military, partnership, which is just a far-right totalitarian state, right? It's just another Pinochet or another set of new victims, right? That would be, again, similar to countries like Portugal who have gone through this before, or, or other places that have gone from a far left to a far right authoritarian state. Just means more victims. Maybe faster path to democracy. History would say that is true, but it's more human suffering. So I wouldn't be in favor.
Yeah, and you're also saying about democracy. Can you give an example? Which country you see as a great example of democracy?
A good example of a
Yeah.
democracy.
Like you want to have it in Venezuela, like say like that country.
Well, a country that has a democracy,
Yeah,
it's not just democracy that you have to have in the country. You also have to have a balance of power within that country. And I'll give the United States a good example of that. We have three branches of government: judicial, the executive, and the legislative. Yes, sometimes it looks like they're out of whack, but if you take a long view of history, you'll realize that the judicial branch keeps the other branches in line, and the legislature keeps the other two branches in line, and the executive keeps the other two branches in line. And there's always this adversarial part of the democracy that keeps everybody honest. Let's go back in history. Nixon, I mean, he was getting ready to be impeached and removed from office. Democracy worked because he was held accountable for his actions. And whenever you have a government where people are held accountable to their actions, which you don't really have in Venezuela, because there's a lot of people down there who are still in a power to oppress other people. And another thing too, if you have a democracy, you still have to have a rule of law. where you have basic human, rights like bill of rights. The government just can't come into your house and look at your stuff without having a warrant and probable cause. That is in the Constitution. No unreasonable searches. And as long as you have balanced power in the government and a bill of rights for a way to protect individuals from being oppressed by the government, to me, that's a good country. Now, you don't have that in China. You don't have that in Russia, and you definitely don't have it in Iran. You don't have it in Venezuela, and you don't have it in a lot of these autocratic states. And there's another thing I want to mention. We talk about democracy being an ideologue, but actually, there was a guy named Immanuel Kant who lived in the late 1700s who came up with this idea of perpetual peace. And his ideas have been modified over a period of time, but democracies historically has been proven to a certain degree that they don't go to war with each other. You know why they don't go to war with each other? Because there's a mechanism for dialogue, and you got different parts of the government, you got different power structures that have been decentralized that keep war to a minimum. But in autocratic states, you don't have that. You get people in power who want to fill their coffers, and they're willing to kill and steal to do that.
How about democracy going to war with non-democracies? Does that count? Does that count human tragedy? Does that count violence?
That's a different.
I know it's different, but on that level, human tragedy, we want peace, right? On that level, is that any different? Democracy versus a non-democracy?
Well, let me, I didn't, finish my thought before you interrupt me, okay?
I apologize.
Okay? My
Make it
thought
quick.
was, with Venezuela, there's a huge oil field that they discovered off of Guyana. And Maduro was actually taking preparations to invade Guyana for those oil revenues. And there was pressure internationally about that, but nobody talks about that. Maybe Maduro was getting ready to do that. Maybe our administration knew something that we don't know. I don't know. But that was something that was in the background that that's kind of fell off the cliff with all this other stuff.
Yeah,
And by the
BBC
way,
report.
100 years ago, we did back Venezuela in a world courts type of thing, where the Europeans backed Guyana. So, Venezuela, historically, they've always had their back by the United States. We had supported them where the Europeans didn't. And let's keep that in mind.
Something else.
So my query is, what is the new deal with what's her name? Gonzalez, I believe is her name. Yeah.
Rodriguez, you mean?
Yes, Rodriguez, yeah. What is the new deal with her? Is she going to be able to get the gold back from England or the key bonds back from the US?
No, England has already said that, again, they're holding it in limbo until they get further clarification on who governs Venezuela. So that like 4 or 5 billion in gold is.
I'm volunteer.
4 or 5 billion. And then what is the new deal in terms of sanctions? Obviously, you can't get oil out of there without easing some of the sanctions. What's the new deal with that?
Well, my understanding is that all of the oil has to go through the United States and then is sold or brokered by the United States. And then that money is deposited into, the US Treasury, which then distributes it back to the private banks in Venezuela via the government of Qatar. To protect Venezuela from creditors.
So Trump has said that you can sell oil and we'll keep the proceeds and you can buy from the US. Is that what the deal is?
So the US is buying or is brokering the oil, and then from the profits of that sale, the US keeps a portion of it, and then another portion goes to Venezuela.
You can
And
only buy the
that's
goods
in a
from the
bank
United
account
States.
that's
That's what he
held by the
mentioned.
US.
That on the money, you can buy the goods from the US.
Oh, yes, yeah.
So it's
Everything,
actually pretty much overpriced stuff and there it goes there.
yeah, I mean, everything right now, products come from the United States, again.
I mean, everything produced in the United States is overpriced.
Yeah, I mean,
They're the one that buying from outside the world for cheap from China, everywhere, but whatever they produce is expensive because of the labor and everything.
Yeah, I mean, like, they put it into the perspective of you have nothing, and then now you
Yeah,
have
basically getting
overpriced
something.
something. And nothing because the entire ability for the country to produce nationally, was not only disincentivized by the actions of the government, but was, mismanaged, what remained of it, right? I mean, you have people that, you go to the hospital, you have to bring your own scalpel, you have to bring your own, bed, you have to bring your own everything to be treated, okay? So having something is better than nothing. And that's just the base reality of human suffering, right? And to go back to that example, right? If you're being tortured like these people are, and they come out and say, we would beg to go back to our cell that was full of human fecal matter, full of cockroaches, full of rats, but it was better than being tortured. I think that's a good microcosm of what the reality of is. When you have nothing and no other options, something is better than nothing.
Yeah, I mean, that's unfortunately, that's how it is right now, because it's like, you have some group of countries that controlling, it's the first world country from there, and then you have a third world country, the rest of the world, and they're all suffering in it. It's
But
like
don't-
big Africa, big,
That is-
whatever,
That
they're all
is
suffering.
That is because Venezuela is suffering because of its decisions. It is in this position where it's beholden to these other countries in this way because of its own decisions. They democratically elected Chavez. And then the people in power seize that power to become an authoritarian state. You cannot put blame on Russia, China, Iran, or the United States for those decisions. Those decisions are with the Venezuelan people.
How did Chavez win the election to begin with?
Democratically, well, he had a coup d'etat, he was imprisoned, and then he ran for president after, he had served his time, and then he was democratically elected. And immediately started consolidating power within the executive branch, and creating, forcing the court system to, its breaking point where it required them to call it constitutional crisis and rewrite the Constitution in a way where the president could legislate through executive order. The president had entire control over every part of the judiciary branch, completely erased the democracy with that constitutional crisis, and allowed them to become what they are today, right? All of that was the bedrock of the authoritarian state. Those are Venezuelan decisions. I guess I want to make sure that people hold us accountable, right? Like, we can't say that, oh, poor us, everybody else, whatever. We made those decisions. Those are our
I know.
decisions.
The only thing is like, it looks like, if you just bring like the best president of Venezuela, right, this best person, he's just gonna show up, say, okay, I'm gonna do everything for you guys. I'm not gonna take a penny. Like, that's it, everything for you, but there's no money. Like, I mean, I cannot do anything for you because we don't have anything. The oil, we don't belong to us anymore. We don't have this, we don't have that. That's it. I mean, our old stuff is actually somewhere there, just given to some other guy, whatever. So there's nothing I can give it to you. I mean, it's nice to be in the US where you can just print the dollars in there, like $3 trillion a year, like whatever, you give it to people, whatever, they're spending it, and you're like, okay, I'm fine. But Venezuela, they cannot print the money. I mean, the more they print, the more inflation goes up. The
Yeah.
more the poorer people are gonna become. And there's no money, you're not generating any money, you don't have any business, you don't have any resources to sell anymore, that's it, there's no money, so you have to get the loans, you have to get some money from somewhere else, just to start doing something in there.
Yes.
Why other country will invest in you, like you go to China, for example, China say, hey, you know what? I mean, we just finished with you, I mean, we gave you a lot of money and that's it, I mean, you just kicked us out. And the same thing with everybody else, US said, you know what? No, not really. I mean, we're not interested. I mean, we just go for profits.
Mhm.
So then who's gonna really invest into Venezuela to make it prosperous? So they have money, they can just live a good life. Everybody get a job, they can buy food and because democracy really, it's not really about democracy. It's really about just like be safe, have a food, have a job, raise a family. That's the only thing people care about. They don't care about who's gonna be the president as long as all this thing is there.
Mhm.
So how's it really gonna go, right? I just don't see the future for Venezuela, actually.
Well, but I think that's selling the situation
Yeah,
in a wrong image because the oil money is flowing to the Venezuelan people right now for the first time in many, many years. That's just a fact. We're saying, oh, the US is keeping it. The US is keeping a portion. They're not keeping all of it. We were getting none of it
I
before.
mean, we don't know really. I mean, we're just talking about the.
No, we do know because all the dollars
I
are.
wanna see the real, what's happening, because right now, the only thing we know is just Trump saying, hey, you know what? We're gonna take the
Well,
oil, we're
Yeah.
gonna do something, we're gonna put our account. and
His
then
point
we'll
is,
sell you some stuff.
his point is his bar is very low. So the chances are we're going over that bar is very high.
Yeah.
You know, from eighth, ninth level of hell to seventh, the bar is pretty
The
low.
300 million
That's
from
where
that
his-
first sale immediately went to stabilize the prices, so we do see it. Chicken was $16 a kilogram 2 weeks ago, now it's $10. That's a real change for real people. The coin is starting to stabilize at a crazy price.
Do the people have the money to buy all this stuff?
Did they have it before?
Yeah, that's the thing, if
They
there's-
can
if
buy,
there's no
they can
money-
now buy 50% more than they could, than
I
they
mean,
did
if there's
before.
no money, it doesn't
And-
matter,
and-
50% of that nothing is still nothing.
And more importantly, for the first time since 2024, we saw student organizations come out and not be repressed immediately by the state to protest the release of the political prisoners.
Okay,
That's
does
the
that
first time
translate
since
into food on the table and secure, safe and security?
It translates to clearly, the incentives are no longer there for the state, the regime, to repress.
So does it translate to food on the table?
Well, the chicken does. The reduction in prices does, which is the first half, but more importantly, not being dead is good. Not being kidnapped in the middle of the night and taken to a torture center is good. Then you can worry about having dinner. But if you're worried about being kidnapped in the night because you, in many cases, people would literally go file a complaint because there was dirty water, unsafe drinking water. And because that was not in support of the state, those people were taken to torture centers. We're talking about 17, 18-year-old students. So they weren't thinking about dinner. They were thinking about, can I give this vocal complaint? I'm not going to say anything bad about the government, but can you at least have safe drinking water? No, you're going to go to a torture center.
Oh, but you know that, even the people in the United States now, getting kidnapped by the ICE.
Absolutely.
And being tortured, whatever, it's a
Absolutely.
democracy in there. I mean,
Absolutely.
can we call it a regime now?
When 70 million Americans leave the United States because they're starving, we can talk about that. But don't try to compare the US reality to the suffering of people in Venezuela. Because the vast majority of people here, even in the worst conditions here, live better than your average Venezuelan. Where 97% of people live in extreme poverty with no water, no electricity, no right to say anything negative about the government at all. I had one post on Facebook in 2014, and they said they were going to come and kill my whole family for holding a sign, for taking pictures of what they were doing. Can that happen here? Absolutely, which is why you should make sure to voice your complaints against what ICE is doing. Make sure to use your democracy to your advantage before it becomes what it became in Venezuela. But do not compare what people live here to the suffering and the reality of an actual authoritarian state.
Let me explain one part. I am from Argentina. So, I know exactly what the United States made when intervened our government. And we have 25,000 people disappeared because it was the students to complain about the bus stop, because if looks like someone, you totally disappear.
Mhm.
So, that was what United States made for us. So I don't believe a single that United States will follow for democracy, because it wasn't never in Latin America.
Yeah.
So, and what you explained, I saw in my own country. What, when we have the militaries, United States give a lot of money to the militaries, that the money disappeared, like Pinochet. And, this money didn't go to the people. No, it stayed in the government and they steal the money.
Yeah.
So, only time will show you what could happen in the future.
Yeah.
But as I saw in Chile, in Argentina, in República Dominicana, never works in this moment. But what you say that have something instead of nothing, yes, but how about if next year the United States say, okay, the oil is out and no give any money back? It's your reserve.
Yeah,
So how you will deal with that after? It's like open the
That's-
door, it's open the door to thinking that the things will be worse.
Mhm.
And if it's not working, so you already gave your reserves.
Yeah.
That is the only that you have. But
no, it's not, it's not.
my question is, if you don't have the petroleum,
Mhm.
what another resource do Venezuela have
Mhm.
to build economy?
So one of the really sinister things that Chavez did was he built the Venezuelan identity around oil. It became synonymous,
Yeah.
identifying with oil, which was intentional. It was because they wanted to take these kind of actions to say, this is ours, this is ours. Oil is an asset, just like there are many other assets. They chose to center the economy around one thing and created it as part of the national identity. But it's not the only thing Venezuela has.
Okay.
Even beyond minerals, you have huge amounts of agricultural land that is not developed, that could be. We used to be a large exporter of agricultural goods to Latin America. We have tourism. We had our own automotive industry, so we have manufacturing. So even if we don't have oil, we're still better off than other countries that truly have only tourism, say, right? Look at Honduras, look at, Cuba, look at Puerto Rico. We're still in a better position because of our actual location. We have the longest continual coast on the Atlantic, which makes us very good for getting goods out of Venezuela or from Latin America to the United States, to Europe, right? More similar to Portugal in that sense, where you're very strategically located with a lot of coastline, right? And then you have things like tourism and those kind of other things. Huh? Yeah, all the agricultural element of that will roll into, so we have other things. And going back to the cases, and this is I recently wrote about this, and it's horrific because I don't like it. Look at Argentina and Chile today. They transitioned back to imperfect democracies. Look at
It was no with the help of the United States.
no, but they did. It was not with the help of the United States, and I'm not saying the US is
But
gonna do it.
Chile spent, I don't remember the numbers, but huge amount of time.
Yes,
And we too, and because at the end, the people rebel against the
Yes.
government.
yes.
Because United States support the government that was on place.
But here's the I hope I didn't come across it. I don't expect the US to, I expect the US to act in its own interest. And I believe that its interest align with a democracy in Venezuela. If it aligned with a far-right military dictatorship, then I would say that. I believe their incentives align with that. But I believe it aligns more with a democracy than with a far-right dictatorship. However, both are very likely right now. In fact, the US in the short term would be better off with a far-right dictatorship in Venezuela that they had full control over. And going back to Argentina and Chile, here's the key difference. The militaries there, and you see this a lot with far-right dictatorships, historically, they are more likely to transition back to democracy. Why? Because in far left authoritarian states like Cuba, the entire systems, every institution is filled with loyalists. So while it's horrific to say this, it's just the reality. Did the Chileans and Argentines wait longer or less to return to democracy than the Cubans? And that's the reality. That's horrible to say. But again, we are in a far left authoritarian state. And the cold calculus is that being even in a far right authoritarian state, as horrible as many victims as there would be, as much as we don't want that, as much human suffering that would cause, historically speaking, it sets us closer to democracy than staying in a terminal state. So the horrible metaphor I gave is, imagine a doctor comes to you and you have an incurable disease that you're in misery and says, I can cure your disease but I have to give you stage 4 cancer. You're still going to suffer, but you might be able to treat it. But your current disease you can't treat and you're miserable. And you're never going to be able to cure it. But I can give you stage 4 cancer. You're still going to suffer, which in this case is a far-right authoritarian state, but you might be able to treat it. That's the horrible reality. And only those that are in that horrible reality, similar to the person being tortured, who begs to go back to their cell filled with fecal matter and cockroaches and rats, begging to go back to that horrible place because being tortured is worse, objectively speaking, even though both are horrific. And
Yeah, I
that's
understand.
the reality.
That's a
You give
predicament.
me a little bit for info.
It's just difficult. And I go back to the decisions are the people accountable are the Venezuelan people. That is why I'm doing this. That is why I continue to voice, every
Yeah, I
part of my
recognize.
voice to align U.S.
We
incentives
have
with
a
a
question
transition to
from
democracy.
online. I want to make sure it's in before we run out of time. By the way, I really recognize, and I'm also glad to hear the potential of Venezuela economically and politically. Otherwise, we just need to let that happen, make right decisions. But there's
And
a,
real quick pasta. Why do you think after Maria Corina Machado left the White House and after, that time with Trump, they asked her, what did you say to Trump? And she said, I asked him, and she stressed this multiple times, to trust the Venezuelan people. And that speaks to what you just said. You trust, we hope that we can trust the Venezuelan people to make the right decisions. That is what she's trying to convey to him.
okay.
That a democracy better aligns with the incentives of the United States, but that the current regime cannot be trusted and will betray the U.S. interest.
I think Machado represents Venezuela interest of people, well, by saying that, like requesting that to Trump.
And she knows that the U.S. will only act out of self-interest.
Right, of course. The question is from Dale on Zoom, why did Chavez and later Maduro have their own TV talk shows? And what were the ratings of those talk shows? Did you?
I have no idea of the ratings. I know he would often, why does Trump tweet every thought? I mean, it's the same thing, right? They're narcissistic people who love hearing themselves talk. Chavez famously gave like 8-9 hour addresses, right? It's just probably because they individually enjoyed it. Like that's it.
And they own the TV station, I suppose. They don't have to.
Oh, yeah. All of the states.
Ratings and revenues and stuff.
If you wanted it to be on, was it?
Yeah, you know what, going back to authoritarian states, I did a lot of reading on this, and it's very sad. The reason that a far right authoritarian state is more likely to go to democracy is because they're so violent up front. Far left authoritarian regimes kill more people over time, but they fill institutions with loyalists. Far right authoritarian regimes, they see the judge that's currently sitting and is let's say a democratic judge, not democratic like, Democrat or Republican, but just someone who believes in democracy. And they say, if you don't rule in our favor, we will kill you. And if they don't rule in their favor, they kill them. They don't take the judge and say, actually, here's my friend, let me put you there. So when the regime, the far right regime falls, the judge that was sitting there is still a person who believed in democracy. Not someone who believed in either the ideology or part of the system. And so far left authoritarian states kill more people over time. Far right kill more people up front and are incredibly violent up front, but historically speaking, they are more likely to transition back to a democracy. We see that post-Maoist China, we see that post-Soviet Union, we see that with Cuba, we see that in Venezuela.
And you're gonna see that.
Robert?
US,
Robert,
when the US collapsed, that's what.
we're running almost out of time, Robert,
I
please.
just want to say something about what he said and support what he said. Yeah, military juntas do transition back to democracy, and Turkey is a very good example. And I think one of the reasons why is that most military folks are heavily like bureaucratic. They believe in, there's got to be some kind of system of hierarchy and bureaucracy and stuff like that. But they know that the military is limited when it comes to civil judicial rulings and other stuff. So eventually they have to relinquish that power, which it does go back into a democratic system. But military juntas tend to be much more pragmatic than the left-wing ideologues who do put loyalists in certain key positions. And I do agree with you.
And it's horrible, and they're both horrific, and I guess I'll preface that, I don't want a far-right dictatorship in Venezuela. And there's an objective truth of what they would bring and the potential. It's, again, it goes back to, if I have an incurable disease and someone says I can give you stage 4 cancer and you can maybe treat it, you might die, but you can maybe treat it. Again, something is better. than nothing.
I mean,
That's the last word.
It's
We're
a
running out of time.
dictatorship. It just switched from Maduro to US to Trump.
Yeah, which is why I don't want the
It's switched
dictatorship,
pretty
yeah.
much. And I'm pretty sure like the world and the Venezuela are gonna have a better life once post US. Like you said, post Soviet, post whatever, post US, is the world gonna be a better place. That's what I was gonna.
Are you open to that possibility?
That what?
Like the post-US era of Venezuela? Would that make you happy if Venezuela people are better off?
Venezuelan people,
But there's gonna be no superpower
Yeah.
to telling you what to do.
well,
Like, they're
Yes,
just gonna, you're
ideally-
gonna be deciding which country you're gonna deal with, who you're gonna trade with, do whatever you want. It's gonna be your country, your people, and nobody from outside, no superpower gonna be telling you, I want this president, I want this from you. So it's gonna be up to your people.
it's just like in our own lives, right? There's always going to be people who have more power, and
Well, gentlemen, we only have 2 minutes back.
that's just the reality, right? Like, if you say, do I think the world would be better if there was no superpowers? I don't know. I don't know what that world looks like.
That's what we
You know what I
can
mean?
try. We had the superpowers, we had the problems. Let's try without a superpower now.
I don't know. I have no
That's-
idea. But that's neither here nor there because they exist. And if it's not the US, then it's, Russia or
Yeah,
China or
because-
somebody else.
Because when you said it's better to be US than anybody else, like a China or Russia or whatever, but if you look back in the last 30 years, what's the US? When they forced the democracy, what's in Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, whatever, at any place, it wasn't the better. Those countries, they became like, superpowers or really wealthy countries over there, or like any like democracy in there. No, they just destroyed them. They
Absolutely.
just got the resources, destroyed them, left them, and went somewhere else.
Yeah,
That's exactly what they're doing.
it's
more like a cancer.
there's,
That's how I see it.
there's also.
That's exactly what you just said.
So we let,
US.
Eduardo has a response to that and we wrap it up because we're heading the
Those are also, in all of those cases in the Middle East, you have to ask yourself, look at the track record of US, let's say imperialism and intervention. What is their success rate in the Middle East? 0. What is their success rate in Latin America? Depends on your definition of success rate, but there are cases where they had success. That's
Which
just
one?
Panama.
Well, you got the Panama Canal.
Well, I mean, they took Noriega out of Panama, and Panama, objectively speaking, a Panamanian person has not only more economic power in the world, regardless of their control over the canal or not, they're in a better position under that than what they were living before.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
so we will let,
So,
Okay.
like,
so that's,
Eduardo have the last
so,
word.
and again, these are like, you're moving from the worst scenario to slightly better scenarios. And that's the problem, right?
So.
Okay, let's wrap it
You have
up.
to work within the world we live in. That's all.
All
that's all I
right,
mean.
we thank Eduardo.
Yeah.
It's very good insight.